So now I'm going to invite to the stage our four panellists and our chair, who is Professor Anthea Hucklesby from the Criminal Justice Research and Law in Essel. She's joined on the stage by Ruth Redfern, who is the Project Director for Inclusive Growth and Social Justice for West Yorkshire Combined Authority, and also by Paul Hayes, who is the Senior Policy Officer for Wakefield Council, and he also deals with policy coordination for the Cities Group. So we've just got the two key panellists who are going to make a short presentation, just verbal presentation, each around what they do and their areas. And then we have two professors on the stage, Andy Brown from the Leeds Business School and Professor Paul Chatterton from the School of Geography, and they're going to act as respondents and just ask a few questions about impact. So I'll leave it to you, Anthea, to take over. Thank you very much.
Okay. My name's Anthea Hucklesby, and I've been asked to chair this session. I'm the Pro-Dean for Research and Innovation in Education, Social Sciences and Law, and I also have an IAA Knowledge Exchange Fellowship Award, so I'm currently working with the Ministry of Justice on electronic monitoring policy and strategy. So it's my great pleasure to introduce our four panellists. And how we're going to work this is that we've got two presentations, firstly from Ruth Redfern, and secondly from Paul Hayes, and then two respondents, Andrew Brown and Paul Chatterton, and then that should leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. Just to say that Ruth Redfern is severely deaf and lip reads, so when we get to the question sessions, can you please bear that in mind, and you might need to come up here so that she can hear your questions. Okay, so I'm very welcome, and are you going to stand up?
Hi, I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. And I think the first thing you might be saying to yourself is, okay then, what is inclusive growth? What might that be? Well, inclusive growth is so everybody can contribute to and benefit from growth. That's the strapline in Leeds City Region. And the reason that's the strapline is it's the shortest version of inclusive growth I can come up with, and therefore I can remember it. So why do we care about inclusive growth? Not this last winter, not the one that we're still in, because we don't have the figures yet, but the winter before, there were more babies with chilblains as a result of cold homes than ever before. And we're the fourth richest country in the world. Care leavers. If you're a female care leaver, you're more likely to go into prostitution than you are to go to college. If you're a male care leaver, you're more likely to enter into the criminal justice system than you are to get a job or go to college. 1 in 6 people are in poverty in Leeds City Region. That's about 500,000. And just have a think about what poverty means. Poverty means you're hungry. Poverty means you're cold. And poverty certainly means no fun. So what about jobs? 25% of jobs in the Leeds City Region pay less than the living wage. And if you're a bloke and you work part-time, 50% pay less than the living wage. So imagine that scenario. You're already working part-time and you're getting paid less than the living wage per hour. That's not very much money. We know, or we think we know, about 20% of nurses are sofa hopping. They're not officially homeless, which is why the figures are a bit thin. But we know they're on people's sofas. Imagine that if you're on shifts. How does that work? In-work poverty has decreased ever so slightly recently. But we have more in-work poverty than ever before. It's madness, isn't it? So what did we decide to do? We decided to develop an inclusive growth programme. But the key to it was it wasn't going to be from the Combined Authority, and I know Combined Authority is after my name, but I don't work for the Combined Authority. I work for all the local authorities in West Yorkshire and York. And we've deliberately designed a collaborative programme where we share good ideas, information, intelligence, where we replicate, where we upscale. Each of the authorities are brilliant at something. So Kirklees, Huddersfield, Batley, Dewsbury are really good at benefits, making sure everybody gets the benefits. If every local authority in West Yorkshire was equally good and shared that, we'd get an extra 76 million quid into West Yorkshire and York. That's a lot of money for the economy. So what Kirklees are doing is sharing that, how they do it, what their system is. We're doing a lot of that kind of sharing. In Wakefield, you're going to hear from Paul with his different hat on, but in Wakefield they're doing a whole range of things on poverty and homelessness. We're sharing that. In Bradford, they've just done a fantastic project with Asian women. Basically, if you're an Asian woman, you are the most likely to be economically inactive. In other words, you're not unemployed because you're not on the record, you're not claiming anything, but you're economically inactive. And they've done a magnificent, very small programme with only 50 Asian women in Keighley. And it's worked. It's taken women who are good at textiles, interested in sewing and knitting and all that kind of stuff, and matched them with textile companies who were desperate for staff. And it's working. It's tiny. 50. Just 50 women. But what if we could do that elsewhere in West Yorkshire? That would be amazing. Now, local authorities are even worse than universities at collaboration. Trust me. We really are. And I know that you wouldn't be here today if you didn't believe in partnership and collaboration, as I do. But getting people to collaborate, to share, has been one of the hardest challenges of this. Because to do it, you have to confess what's failed. Otherwise, it's meaningless. There was a 6-month hiccup in the programme I talk about in Bradford that they couldn't get to the bottom of. And what it was that the women had never been on buses. And they didn't know which bus to get, what colour bus and how the buses worked. They'd never been on buses. They drive, their partners drive, or whatever. Just this particular cohort. I'm not saying it's about all Asian women across the world, you know. Just this particular group. And it delayed the programme for about 6 months because it couldn't work out why they weren't getting on the bus and going there. Once they'd found out about it and resolved it, it was fine. So the most important thing about some of the collaboration that we've done is saying, this was a screw-up. This really didn't work. It was a bit of a disaster, and we had to learn from it. And that's very, very hard for politically accountable organisations, because local press love organisations like councils to make mistakes and make U-turns and all that kind of stuff. So that's quite hard, but we're getting there. We're learning. You'd be proud of us. So public sector reform is something that we're all talking about at the moment. Local government's been so badly hit, it's hard to express how bad austerity is for most people in local government. You've got cities like Bradford that are losing 40% of their budget, which is just massive. They could probably have done with losing 10%, and privately they might admit that. But 40? Kirklees is the same, with people in poverty all around them, trying to provide services. Austerity has hit us hard. And if you're not careful with austerity, what it makes you do is become more efficient and less effective. We become spreadsheet obsessed, and partnership and collaboration gets to the bottom of the pile. So if you want to work with local government, and I really recommend that you do, you'll have to do a bit of the running, because they're skint and they feel it. Finally, I'd say this. Inclusive growth begins at home. You will all have influence in different places, this university and elsewhere. And if you care about those babies with chilblains, and I suspect you do, then think about what you pay in your cleaners. Everybody subcontracts their cleaners. And then they can say, we pay the living wage to everybody. But do they pay the living wage to their cleaners? No, because it's subcontracted. Don't believe anybody who's committed to tackling poverty or inclusive growth unless they've done something about the body who cleans the loos. Inclusive growth, in my head, begins at home. So that's the final ask I have of you. As I say, you will have influence. I don't know what this beautiful university does with their cleaners. I have no idea, so it's not me condemning anyone. But I am saying, find out and do something about it. Thank you very much.
And our second speaker is Paul Hayes, who is a Senior Policy Officer at Wakefield Council, and he too is going to speak to us for about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much and good afternoon. Andy asked me to do something around the industrial strategy, but looking at what this is today, yes, it'll be the same presentation, but it's primarily, given where we're coming from, about thinking about how yourselves as academics engage with place and different places and how places are different, and the industrial strategy is quite a good example of that one. Can we move to the next slide, please? So as I say, today I'm wearing my hat from the Key Cities Group because the Secretariat is provided by Wakefield Council. It was formerly provided by Sunderland. We took it over last year. 21 cities. You can see it's the usual sort of blurb. You'll see it from most organisations and places. We're about improving our voice, making a difference, influencing government, etc. You'll have seen, there's the Core Cities Group, for example, which is Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield. We are the Salfords, the Wakefields, the Kirkleeses, the Hulls of this world, the mid-sized cities as a group. The big difference between, for example, you want a city, if you're looking at Leeds, core cities and mid-sized cities, is the bottom one. we are the places that primarily vote, our residents voted to leave the European Union. The only core city that voted to leave the European Union was Sheffield. The only two mid-sized cities of our group that voted to remain in the European Union were Norwich and Oxford. All the rest of them voted to leave. So in some ways, you can start to see already a difference, and as to why, and how the industrial strategy will address that, and will it, is an open question. Can I have the next slide, please? So this is the government's industrial strategy. Some of you have seen it's not. It is, as I quote, it's an emerging industrial strategy. It's ongoing, it's a development, it's a work in progress. So what the government seems to believe is they are the foundations to the strategy. So if you are writing, these are the buzzwords to use should you be writing funding bids to BEIS and other government departments. It's always useful to know where the trigger words are for anybody writing a funding bid. And these are the grand challenges that the government wants and see for the UK economy to address. Very nice. Next slide, please. The more interesting one, certainly for places like Wakefield, which is the largest city in the UK without a physical university. We'd like one, but I sense it's not going to happen, is the local industrial strategies. The government has a very interesting definition of the word local. They see it as local enterprise partnerships. So what they would call local would be the Leeds City Region. Out of the industrial strategy, there will be a set of local industrial strategies, primarily linked to mayoral combined authorities. The government fetishises elected mayors. Obviously, there isn't one in City Region, Yorkshire, Greater Yorkshire, One Yorkshire, whatever you want to, South Yorkshire, whatever you describe it as the moment. I don't know if people are aware, when the devolution bids were submitted for around Yorkshire, there were 5 separate bids submitted with 5 separate geographies. David Cameron once rightly said that he knew people in West Yorkshire, Yorkshire hated everybody outside Yorkshire. He didn't realise they hated each other even more. And it's actually possibly quite accurate in engagement with places. Different places, certainly in this region, are very different in terms of what they want, what their needs are, and what their compositions are. If you are engaging with a place, with a local authority, with a community, understanding their needs and their differences is vital. We are not homogenous. Kirklees very different to Wakefield. It may seem different, but it's not. Ethnicity, for example, is completely different in Kirklees to Wakefield. So, this is what's happening. One of the interesting ones is what happens below city region level. For places like us, for smaller cities, for the Tees Valleys, for the Prestons of this world, our members, we're starting to find that very interesting. Can we just go on to the last slide then in terms of challenges you might want to think about? For those of you who are involved in economic development, we've worked with Leeds University before on some sectoral stuff for key cities, which was incredibly useful last year, but the ground has moved then. The questions people like me are asking in terms of the industrial strategy is, one, are we back in the 1960s? Are we back with Wilson, National Economic Development Corporations? I would advise anybody who's interested in economic history to probably start reading some more of the 1960s and 70s in Britain and what happened. The return of local enterprise partnerships, which of course are not democratically accountable, are not composed of elected politicians, are primarily composed of business people. That is the body that will be writing the local economic strategies for areas, in areas without an elected mayor. I've spoken to some people from what's called the County Councils Network, and they are spitting blood about it. They do not want local enterprise partnerships to write, so in North Yorkshire, they do not, for example, want the local enterprise partnership to write their economic strategy. They want to write it. So recognise the political tensions within areas that you want to operate in. Also, mission-driven government, the Mariana Mazzucato line around what's the role of government in this, who should you be pitching it to? Are we, for example, should we let the market decide? There's this idea that cities are increasingly post-political, that businesses have higher influence in it, that other stakeholders have a higher influence in it. And once again, back to the 1970s, did the last time we had mission-driven government, it gave us Concorde and DeLorean. So what will come out of that? Where is the line that you as academics want to influence, want to take? This is up for grabs. Government are still One, confused, and two, massively focused on Brexit. You can't get an answer out of a civil servant about almost anything now because they're either in Brexit or, for that, and to be completely honest, within the department, sorry, Ministry of Housing and Local Government, we now have to call it, they're all running around looking after tower blocks because Brexit and Grenfell have literally paralysed whole elements of the civil service that deals with local government. And then the big one for smaller places is, will this deliver the productivity that they want? Will it also be inclusive? Will it deliver employment? So there's a focus, for example, on these very high-tech, high-value industries, aerospace. They are not big employers. I think at most they will employ about 2% of the population currently. What will it do for Dewsbury? What will any of this focus on high technology do? Will we widen the divide between quite high-tech, valuable major places, metropolitan cities, cosmopolitan cities, and between smaller places? Agglomeration economics might work as an economic concept. There's certainly issues about economic agglomeration and agglomeration of prosperity in terms of cohesion and in terms of, should we say, alienation amongst those communities. We had the Northern Way, some of you might remember that in the John Prescott period. It didn't do a lot for Dewsbury or Halifax. It did quite a lot for Leeds and central Manchester. And there are issues around, if you have an inclusive one, where are smaller places and where do smaller places fit into this? And understanding geography. And the other one is events, as Harold Macmillan called them. Things happen, governments fall, governments change, governments... which is why I come back to the industrial strategy, and most government policy now, A, has been made literally the day before. It's not long-term. There's no long-term thinking coming out of Whitehall about almost anything, in any policy area. And how you as academics want to shape that, it's either a threat to you, or it's an opportunity to you to actually grab and try and shape events and influence events. So that would be my parting note would, you have an opportunity to shape the world. Go, and I look forward to you doing it. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. So the next part of this panel is two of my colleagues from the University of Leeds, Andrew Brown and Paul Chashton, have been asked to comment on the presentations. So I think Andy's going to go first.
Okay, thank you very much. Many, many thanks to excellent presentations, really setting out the scene. I am in the economics division of the business school, was involved in the work for Key Cities, which Paul referred to. And just, I think I want to make 3 points, and very much echoing what you've been saying. I mean, the first point is, there is a real opportunity for universities to step in. The universities now have the resource to work, to do research in the public interest. That's crucial. At a time when austerity have taken capacity away from local and national government, this university, as you've heard already, has strength in depth across all the relevant disciplines in social science, in economics, environmental science, engineering. I mean, that is a key strength of ours, and we have the leadership, you heard Lisa Roberts earlier, who understand the need for impact and are resourcing that. So there's a real opportunity for us to step in, and that's very much crucial. Just to give a plug for economics, I mean, if you look at the economics, we've heard from Andy Goulson, ecological environmental economics. We've heard from Karen Lucas, who's from the Institute for Transport Studies, world leaders in terms of transport economics. My own work is in terms of value and political economy. I work with the Treasury in terms of valuation of infrastructure provision. It's a wonderful portfolio just in terms of economics, let alone social science of poverty, inequality and so on. It's all there. So that's my fundamental point. There's a huge opportunity. Problem is how to create structures where we can work together, where you can access, given the lack of capacity, given the lack of time. As you rightly said, we have to run after you. And that's what we're trying to do. The fundamental issue is that academics need long-term research projects which they have to generate published academic outputs on. That means we work at different timescales to the daily calls on your time. But the solution then, okay, very briefly move straight to the solution. Let's not dwell on the problem. The solution is to build up structures of interaction where we can build up an understanding of one another's needs and develop a strategy so that you can access our researchers in the areas that you need, and we can keep our capacity and we can develop published outputs over our more long-term horizons. Now, again, I think it was an excellent example set by Andy Goulson talking about the Climate Change Commission, that first case study, because there you had a university working with Leeds City Council and all the relevant stakeholders for a specific issue, but they're able to build up a programme through time, regular working group meetings, overseen by a committee meeting 4 times a year. That will enable long-term relationships and understanding the area of climate change. And that came out of Tom Noland and Andy Goulson already having a relationship in previous work. If we could build those kind of models in other areas, all the areas of provisioning, be it waste, be it energy, be it adult social care, all of those areas crucial to inclusive growth, I think there's a huge resource. And it's just, we need to just keep working at establishing those relationships. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so my contribution pushes in the same direction as all the speakers, so few. I'm glad of that. But what I really want to focus on is how do we supercharge this agenda, right? But actually with a slightly different inflection, because I think what the universities bring to the table is their ability to articulate the scale of the challenges. So the 5 big urban stresses, you know, economic, energy, air quality, social, climatic, right? We don't have to go through them. The 5 big urban stresses, but how do we translate that into meaningful policy and action? So the inclusive growth agenda, how do we supercharge it with a different inflection? Actually, it's an inclusive development agenda. We've established that we can't have finite, infinite economic growth and a finite biosphere, right? Okay, that's one of the key important things about how do we change the inflection from growth to development. And trickle down isn't working, right? We've known that from generations. So what do we do about the increasing divide between the super rich and the have-nots, right? So how do we genuinely get trickle down to working? We need some kind of practical and policy mechanisms based around these big agendas. So some elements of that include land. How do we really start to build a new approach to the land of this country in terms of redistribution and taxation? Massive change in terms of how we use land as a country. Second element, how do we really get community wealth building going? How do we create community wealth building anchors? Something like the Cleveland model, the Preston model. How do we get local procurement and local value generation really going within city regions? And the third element is a fundamental rethinking of work, right? With a massive tidal wave of automation coming, how do we really start to take on universal basic income, the massive changes in work which are ahead of us? Let's not put our heads in the sand of these huge tsunamis which are ahead, but let's be practical about how we build. So what we've got essentially, 19th century, you could say feudal, 19th century institutions, 21st century problems, right? We need to sit in the middle of them, the quadruple helix academics call it, academy, private sector, public sector, voluntary sector. In the middle is the sweet spot. That's where we need to build civic strength to tackle these huge problems. And we can do that, you know, other cities are really taking this on. And there's elements of all this, the key cities agenda, the inclusive growth movement. These are the elements of this new civic renewal exercise which we need. In a way, a lot of these problems are Westminster problems. They were made there, they need to be resolved there. So we can't do everything locally. So we need new primary legislation that's going to tackle all these issues. So actually it's slightly beyond any city's ability or any university's ability. And the final point is, what does this mean for the impact agenda? Because here we are talking about impact within the university. It means difficult choices about our impact agendas. It means unlocking the potential of some things, which is celebrating alternatives and new ways of doing stuff, But unfortunately, it also means taking on difficult choices of locking down certain difficult activities in our society, which are the powerhouses of ecological damage and social inequality and financial austerity. So it's that dynamic between unlocking and locking down which we need to build our impact agendas around, and that's pretty tough and difficult.
Thank you very much to all the speakers. We have about 20 minutes for discussion, comments and questions. There's one at the front here. Hang on, there's a mic coming.
Hello, I'm Alison from Leeds Commissioning Group. I just wondered how you would see, Ruth, the link with inclusive growth and social prescribing. Social prescribing, which is where primary care are using social situations and social groups and social developments to try and provide healthcare in the community and to try and provide support in the community at a primary level rather than escalating to secondary level and further, but also to encourage less isolation, more group dynamics, more community dynamics, and looking at community assets and using those assets.
Thank you for that. Sorry, I missed a bit of it. I think there's a link, because I think there's a link in terms of the democratisation of the economy. I'm amazed I could say democratisation. Because if you look at the way that communities can actually develop their own small economies, often they're informal rather than formal, particularly in poor areas, but not exclusively. And if you can get the capacity in communities through the social activity there to then start to develop their own levels of, as I say, capacity, creating local jobs, developing cooperatives, all kinds of community wealth building activity, then other people within that self-same community will then seek work outside that community, which currently they tend not to. So if you take a place like Dewsbury, there are very few people in Dewsbury, in either the Asian community or the white community, who travel outside Dewsbury for work. Not because the community doesn't allow it, but because the community itself is absolutely fundamentally closed. It's very tight. It's a community that's got not doors on it, and I don't want to over-egg it, but it's a very closed community, very tight community. Social prescribing, more social interaction, dealing with social isolation, potentially opens some of those avenues, gets people to think a little bit more outside their current bubble. So yes, I do think there is a connection. The other connection I would say is currently in the Leeds City Region, over half the disabled people are unemployed. Long-term unemployed. And by that I don't mean people who are not able to work, I mean people who are able to work are long-term unemployed. We have to do something about that. It ebbs and flows, but it doesn't change very much. We have way too many people who have the potential, the ambition and the desire to work who are not working. And again, I think there is a connection between the social prescribing that can lead on to potential jobs if they're there and if those jobs are welcoming people with disabilities.
Yeah, thank you. Social prescribing is a phrase you're hearing increasingly in local authorities, initially in public health, but it's moving beyond that. One of the things we're talking about in terms of Wakefield's new economic strategy, it would be an ideal thing. The best thing a doctor could ever prescribe a large number of people who went to see him or her would be a £30,000 a year job, which would actually save large numbers of issues in terms of their health, building their social networks, improving their dignity, their self-being, contracting stigma. So there is something around, you're right, the wider determinants of health. And that health is the economy, is where they live, their place, their attitudes on life. We have not got there yet, I'll be completely honest. If people say social prescribing, you think, oh, we'll prescribe you some gym visits, or here's some vouchers to go swimming. That's an initial stage on that. It is looking at the wider determinants of what makes a healthy happiness, what makes a well-being, whether an individual, a family, or a community. And it's a journey that we've started on. So hopefully we'll go a lot further on that.
Either of you want to add? No? Okay. There's one at the back there.
I'm Mark Crowe, work for an organisation called DISC. I mean, I think just to pick up on the social prescribing point, even in the times of austerity, aren't local authorities still one of the largest purchasers, you know, one of the largest engines of economic activity? And haven't they got a duty, an opportunity to think about what they're purchasing differently, rather than, you know, buying services that are kind of service specified? Isn't it time that they started, you know, turning things on their heads a bit and looking to purchase what's needed at the point at the end user point? Isn't that one, you know, that's one engine or one driver that might actually start to bring about some of those issues of inclusive growth?
Okay, I can't hear you. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah. Basically, he was asking whether local authorities should think more carefully about what services they were providing and what they were purchasing.
Okay, commissioning and procurement, yeah?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think local authorities are giving a lot more thought about commissioning, certainly, and commissioning for outcomes. Most local authorities have gone through some kind of process about identifying what the outcomes are that they want and what is the best and most efficient means of doing that, whether that's in-house or not. That's had some success. I think that the biggest difficulty with it is local authorities also have to do a whole load of things that they're not paid to do. One of the speakers earlier was when we were talking about climate change. Local authorities are not paid to do that. One of the points that you made about the connection between universities and local authorities are not paid to have any policy or strategy resource. And yet I think it's the R&D of local government. And we need it more now than we've ever needed it. We desperately need R&D. So that's where the potential connection comes in, doesn't it? So there's a whole bevy of things that we're not paid for, and a whole load of outcomes that we want to achieve. Now, when I said earlier that I thought 10% was probably about right for a lot, it would have been to urge everybody into okay then, adult social care has been around now for 100 years or whatever. We've now got the biggest number, the largest number of people who need it. What outcomes do we really want, and how do we do that? We did when I was working for Kirk Leeds, we did a systems thinking approach for adult social care, and potentially saved about 40 million, which sounds like a lot, but not when you compare the overall demand and all the rest of it. So there are ways of urging us into a better way and thinking about things, but it's gone too far. I would say, not being remotely political, I just think it's just gone too far. In terms of procurement's fascinating. Preston Local Authority have done some fantastic stuff on local procurement. which they do head under the kind of community wealth building, democratisation of the economy and all that kind of stuff. Some amazing work. And to some extent we are stealing that. We now have an anchor programme in West Yorkshire and York, where hopefully the university will be one of those anchors. It's, for the uninitiated, the anchor programme is basically those large institutions anchored in communities using their wealth to support those communities. So you procure locally. When you procure locally, you ensure that people are actually paying decent salaries and making sure that low-paid workers have progression and development, training, etc., etc., etc. So you behave well, you are a good employer yourself, and you ensure through your procurement that others are behaving equally well. So I think there is a lot more we can do on procurement collectively. If you look at all the potential anchor organisations, all the health organisations, universities, colleges, there is a lot more we can do. And what I would like to see before we're done is you can't get a contract in West Yorkshire and York if you don't pay the living wage, if you don't treat people decently and value them. So it's just not possible. And then you try South Yorkshire and you find you can't do it there either. In other words, you get to a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom. Thank you.
Yeah, I should also big up the fact that Preston is a member of the Key Cities Group and is actually doing some really, really interesting stuff. Yes, I am going to take the credit. No, I wouldn't do that. There's some very, very dedicated people in Preston, and literally we are learning from. Certainly they're coming over to Wakefield in the next month, and we want to actually look at embedding the Preston model in Wakefield. And local procurement and local commissioning, and I think they trebled the amounts that Preston Council spent within Preston itself and within wider Lancashire in 2 years. So that's an option. One of the issues to this is this involves culture changes in local authorities and a response to austerity. Ruth mentioned that on average, every local authority pretty much has had a 40% cut in its funding since 2010. Businesses have a 40% cut, stop doing things, they go bust. We can't stop doing things. At the same time, demand for adult care, children's care is rising by about 5% a year. 70% of the average upper-tier local authority's budget goes straight onto adults and children's care, which is why there are no corporate centres pretty much left in local authorities. Because the politically correct non-jobs, to quote our former Secretary of State, myself and Ruth and people like that, have pretty much all gone because it was us or social workers, and they kept, probably rightly in many cases, the social workers. The other issue is that local authorities are the only people who have by law a statutory duty to set an annual balanced budget, or the councillors can have their houses taken off them. This concentrates their minds wonderfully and certainly says, cultures, I would love to pay, I've heard commissioning people say, I would love to pay the living wage, but I've got 5,000 people, elderly people, in care homes, and if the care home people's paying £7 an hour, well, that's awful, but I've got 7,000 people to put into a care home. And there is that tension in terms of how you spend, what you spend it on, and basically the choking off of what we would love to do through austerity.
Question there. Oh, no. Sorry. There's a question there.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Stephen Curry. I'm from the Upper Calder Valley Renaissance Project in the Calder Valley, would you believe? I want to talk about collaboration. We quite often put forward ideas for collaboration with our local authority, and two things can happen. One is you'll find an officer that's really keen on it. Another thing that can happen is that there's either an officer objection, not quite the right word, resistance or political resistance. And the sort of examples I'm talking about are things like asset transfer to the community. The local authorities, as we know, are shrinking and they can't provide all the services, they can't maintain all their buildings, and there are community groups that are willing to stand up and take over some of those assets. There does seem to be a resistance to that. And I think locality, the former Development Trust organisation, in a recent report pointed out that there is political resistance to some of this because it seems like it's a little bit of loss of power if you lose some of your assets to community groups. And so I've been to, 5 conferences in the last 2 years where collaboration has been the theme. And I find that there's a lot of talk about it and there's a lot of resistance to it from particularly local authorities. Have you any comments on that? Is that your experience?
The question was asking, I assume the Renaissance Project is a community project?
Yes.
Yeah. The Renaissance Project is a community project, and they've made a lot of efforts to collaborate, particularly with local authorities, but that's met with objections and resistance from a number of quarters, so it hasn't really taken off, and he was asking why that might be. Is that a good summary?
Yeah, if that's the sort of experience of the people who work in local authority, that there is, I would say it's not aggressive resistance, but it's there.
I'd say we are collaborating now more than we have ever collaborated. Some of it through necessity, some of it through choice. It's increasingly through choice, and we see the value of it. You mentioned around asset transfers. I can give you one of the problems with asset transfers is you have to actually guarantee that that asset, that physical asset, the community group that says it can look after it and will maintain it and will make it thrive, is able to do that. Because if it goes bust 3 to 5 years down the line, the local authority carries the can. I have some very worried lawyers and very worried property people around asset transfers. I have seen asset transfers that have basically failed, and we have to pick it up with cost and time. There is something around increasingly both voluntary community groups, third sector, other institutions and local authorities understanding each other and working with each other and understanding where each other's coming from. We do that in every area. Calderdale will do it, Kirklees did it, now has some form of forum where we sit down with the third sector and we're building long-term relationships with community groups in the third sector. And sometimes that's not easy, because we're also, for example, moving from a culture where the third sector would come to you and expect some money. You would give them some money, they would go away and do some good things, whatever that was. And then we say, well, what have you done? We need to align it to our strategic objectives. And there was cross wires around that one. We're moving towards more of a sharing thing. There's tensions do the third sector and community groups. Do some of them think that they're being used as the delivery arm for public services? Do they want to be the delivery arm for public services? So there are tensions that we have to work through and understand.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that's right. I would say, though, it does vary from local authority to local authority. You know, and I mentioned earlier about some people are into spreadsheet efficiency at the moment. That doesn't lead towards collaboration and co-production and partnership. It really doesn't. It's kind of, you know, everybody in rows and delivering exactly this and no more, no less, you know, because people are scared. You know, if you had a 40 to 45% reduction in your household income fairly quickly, you would probably turn to some kind of spreadsheet and say, okay, then we will not do this and we will do that and we will, you know, because actually it's a big proportion. So I would say, whilst I absolutely agree with Paul, and I think that, you know, a lot of local authorities are doing that, we absolutely need to co-produce. We need to get over some of the legal things that have been there for 300 years and all kinds of other bloody obstacles and do this differently. There are other local authorities who've banged up the hatches a bit because they're frightened.
I think we've got time for one last question or comment. One at the front here.
What is it? There.
Thank you. Faye McNullah from the Cities theme in the University of Leeds. My question's really about the structures and how can we make the collaboration between the third sector, the public sector, the local authorities, etc., and the research in the university sector work more effectively as basically, I think there's been two main challenges from what I can see, the sort of austerity agenda, and then in the universities, the agenda for more impact, really. So I just want to get some reflections of how you think we can take this forward. We've heard about Andy Gouldson's Climate Commission, but what are the other kind of mechanisms that might be out there?
Yeah, I've got quite, as I mentioned to one of the groups as I first came in, for about the last 4 or 5 years, I've managed from the council side, Wakefield Council's Memorandum of Understanding with Leeds Beckett University in terms of how we've operated and engaged with the university, being the largest local authority area in the country without a university presence. And at times it's been difficult for both sides. There is a cultural issue. There is an issue definitely around austerity. One of the cultural issues, if I gave a politician anything with footnotes and a reading list on, I'd just get it thrown back at me. So I want 4 bullet points and tell me what to do. Officers sometimes, from our end, are actually quite distrustful of academics. I've seen it. You either live in an ivory tower, or, even more scary, you know too much, and you'll show them up. And you'll show what they've been doing wrong for years. Interfaces, for example, we work with Simon at the PPIU. You need people who culturally understand different institutions, and gatekeepers and brokers work well. The other thing I found, certainly with Leeds Beckett, was, and I'm not dissing that university, there's some fantastic people there, I work well with them, I'm actually writing a full disclosure, I'm doing a PhD there at their business school, it's that they don't operate as a corporate institution. And you find this with academic institutions. Oh, you need to talk to X in that faculty, Y in that school, Z over there. Oh, no, and events for us come very quickly. As you said, different timescales we operate on. Well, we'll come back to you in 18 months with a report, or we'll do a paper. No, I've got 6 weeks. You know, I've got Ofsted coming in. Tell me what I need to do about this issue around children. And there's some things we operate at different paces, with different agendas, and sometimes we speak different languages. I have people who roll their eyes. They say, we're in academics, when are they going to say neoliberalism? Because I know I'm going to roll my eyes at the suitable moment when somebody's going to mention neoliberal. And there, cultural brokerage between, certainly with academic institutions, and elements of the public sector, I think is a skill that people need to pick up.
I agree with that. I think particularly the timing point. I've had the same sorts of conversations. You know, we have a crisis. I was in Kirklees when Britain first were going to do their major rally. They were doing one in Luton and one in Dewsbury. And there were various bits of research, actually, we could have done with at that point to help the thing, to manage the damn thing and the damn people. They were horrible. Anyway, and we managed it well, and there were no arrests, and nobody from Dewsbury joined the rally, which I regard as a huge hit. But by the time we knew they were coming, we literally had 6 weeks. So some of the things that we needed, that we could have probably have done with, about how the young people felt, were they likely to join in, you know, all that kind of stuff, some of which we had, but as I say, the R&D of local government has largely gone. So some of which we had, but we could probably have really done with some kind of intensive academic, you know, come on, right, what are the kids thinking, where are they going to go, how do we manage this? But very quick, and we needed it, as I say, within 6 weeks. The other thing I would say is bring us solutions, you know, third sector and public sector. You know, when I said about systems thinking in adult social care, those kinds of things where you're introducing people to a range of ideas, but those ideas then lead to savings and more efficiency, better productivity. Systems thinking, for the uninitiated, is really not rocket science. It's basically asking the customer and the frontline worker what they think would be a better system. Now, I'm slightly oversimplifying, not by much. But it brought us some solutions. It got frontline staff genuinely listened to, it got the customers genuinely listened to, and we cut through 50 years of systems that had just developed and got bigger and fatter over time. Bring us solutions.
Okay, thank you. I don't know whether you have any final short, very short comments that you'd like to make.
I just wanted to make sure that the Leeds University cleaner issue didn't get lost, and maybe we could return to it at a later date to find out, because I know that Leeds citizens, for example, approached university on that basis a few years ago to set up a local chapter to address that issue of pay in the university amongst cleaners. But I don't know if anyone else has got any, I don't know where that went, but any other knowledge in the room on that issue that you directly inquired about?
Okay, and on that note, I'm going to say thank you very much to all of the panel, but particularly to our two invited guests today. So thank you very much, Ruth and Paul, for coming and for answering the questions very diligently. Thank you very much, and thank you very much to you two too. I'm going to hand over to Karen Lucas, but before we do that, can we say thank you in the usual way?
So I'm not going to spend a lot of time, hold you up any longer. One of the things I would say though before you leave is if you could fill in your evaluation sheets, it'd be really helpful for us all to monitor how the event went. I think it's been it's a shame that there's less and less people in the room. I guess this is our busy time, but I think it's been a really successful day, and I feel like I've really managed to engage with the Leeds Social Science Impact Agenda. I think maybe that in a way it may even offer a model for the university more widely to try and deal with some of these issues. I've certainly learnt a few lessons, and I'll just make a couple of observations, which is, I think, seeing things from the external partner's perspective in the way in which you've described, and understanding the challenges of austerity and all the other sort of problems that are out there, but being able to identify together some key issues and working in partnership towards some very key joint agendas would be a really helpful way to take this sort of co-production and partnership idea forward further. So perhaps we should be more, we should maybe offer a more systematic approach to the types of ways in which we're delivering impact, and by doing that be more impactful, in fact. I personally feel that research that doesn't make a difference is research that really, I'm not sure why it's happening. Really, why are you doing research if you don't intend to make a difference? And I think that by collaborating with the people who really need some answers on the ground, some practical answers, to try and solve some of the questions that are hanging there, we really can make a really good contribution as researchers. I very much have got this message about austerity and funding streams. I think as universities we've tended to look to our public sectors as the funders of research, and maybe we need to think of in a different way that we need to find the resources in order to be able to help to make our research impactful. And so there are perhaps some new models that are needed in terms of how we fund these impact exercises. I think that we also need to think a bit about the way in which you've talked about accommodating each other's capacities and skills and other resource constraints, about timing, and the need for this engagement to be long-term, really, not piecemeal, long-term and consistent. I think the social sciences are particularly important for leading this agenda because it is, after all, we're looking at society, we're looking at these issues about how society is affected, whether that be through environmental issues, housing, health, poverty, whatever. But these are the key issues for the social sciences, so we should really be seeing ourselves at the forefront, and I think that Leeds Social Sciences Institute has really begun to develop that coherence, and you can see that in some of the case studies, but we should perhaps be engaging higher up the university with Leeds, Lisa Roberts and her colleagues in RIS and so forth, the Research and Innovation department, to really think about this as a more cohesive programme that happens across the university. So I think all I can say is that I would think that what you should be doing is not thinking about the impact of your research, but thinking about building impact by design into your research, so that that is the way that you begin. What impact can my research make? What questions can I answer that need resolving? Who is it that I need to speak to make sure that this gets taken up and I'm asking the right questions? So building it in by design. Thank you all for coming. thank you all for participating. I hope we've got some really good recommendations that are not just my own voice to take up to another level and to consider for our programme as we go through into March 2019. Please watch this space, is what I would say. We have a website. We try to disseminate our materials as widely as we can, and you're all welcome to join LSSI. Thank you.